Hello everyone, my name is Luca, better known as LegenVD on YouTube, and today I'll be doing a walkthrough for some of the decks you might see in this weekend's Arena Championship 1. The format for this tournament will be Dominaria United Draft and Alchemy Constructed, so if you haven't kept up with the Alchemy format or you're just curious to see what the pros came up with, this will help you out. We will ease into it with Matthew's Monoblack, which is not too dissimilar from the standard counterpart, a pretty controlling strategy with lots of great removal options and nice 2-for-1 creatures, and the new additions from Dominaria include Sheoldred the Apocalypse, the 4-mana 4/5 legendary Phyrexian Praetor with Death Touch that will gain life as we draw cards while making the opponent lose 2 whenever they draw a card, and then we also have 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil, a 3-mana Planeswalker, can make the opponent sacrifice a creature, and then the +1 will make each player discard a card. Then we've got some nice spot removal at 1 mana with Cut Down, another new addition from Dominaria, and then at 2 mana, an Alchemy exclusive here is Cast Down, being able to destroy a non-legendary creature, as well as Infernal Grasp. Then we've got some nice creatures with Shambling Ghast, which did rotate out of Standard, but is still legal thanks to the Baldur's Gate printing, so a nice 1 mana creature that can leave behind a treasure or shrink something down when it dies. Then we've got Tenacious Underdog, giving us a nice late-game Blitz ability out of the graveyard to draw extra cards. And then the Meathook Massacre is the Alchemy version here, you might notice, does not gain any life, but is still a nice tool against opposing creature decks and can still drain the opponent as our creatures die, so pretty good synergy with Underdog. Then at 3 mana we also have Graveyard Trespasser, giving us a bit of graveyard hate and pretty difficult for the opponent to get rid of without getting a 2-for-1 in our favor. And then a Sanguine Brushstroke is one of the Alchemy exclusives that will make a Blood token and leave behind a Blood Artist on the battlefield, which will also drain the opponent as more creatures die, and then whenever we sacrifice a Blood token, each opponent also loses 1 life, and we can generate more of these Blood tokens with our City Stalker Connoisseur, a 4-mana 3/3 with Death Touch, will make the opponent discard their most expensive non-land card when it enters a battlefield, and also makes a Blood token, so another nice 2-for-1. And then topping off our curve, 4 copies of Invoke Despair, which can be an awesome answer to enchantments, creatures, as well as planeswalkers, while maybe drawing a few cards and dealing some damage in the process. Great synergy with our Sheoldred as well, which can also gain additional life. And then our mana base, very simple, just 23 Swamps, 1 Abandoned Mire, and 2 copies of Field of Ruin to mess with the opponent's mana base. And then potential sideboard cards could include a Ray of Enfeeblement as a great 1-mana removal spell for white creatures, and there's Mind Spike as a 1-mana discard effect, which could also come in handy, and of course there's plenty of other black removal spells that can be brought in out of the sideboard. Next up is Sam's Red-Black Sacrifice, which is also not too dissimilar from its standard counterpart, the main difference being access to Sanguine Brushstroke once again, conjuring a copy of Blood Artist onto the battlefield, and then has a ton of synergy with Blood tokens in this deck as well, so we can also drain the opponent with our Brushstroke just by sacrificing our Blood tokens. Blood Artist, of course, very synergistic with Oni Called Anvil, which is the main engine card that makes this sacrifice deck tick, saying whenever 1 or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield during your turn, create a 1/1 colorless construct artifact creature token, can only trigger once each turn, and we can also tap, sacrifice an artifact to deal 1 damage to each opponent and gain 1 life, so this will continuously help us enable our Blood Artist to slowly drain the opponent. And then we've got other Blood token enablers with our Voldaren Epicure, dealing 1 damage to the opponent when it enters, making a Blood token, and at 2 mana Blood Tithe Harvester, which also makes a Blood token, can be used as removal, and just a nice 2 mana 3/2 creature that can start applying pressure, so we can sacrifice all these Blood tokens to Anvil to also make additional 1/1s and to drain with our Brushstroke. We also have some new additions from Dominaria with Braids, which can function as a nice card draw engine, especially when we sacrifice artifacts. The opponent may be unable to sacrifice an artifact if they don't control any, in which case they lose 2 life and we get to draw a card. And then we also have 2 copies of Sheoldred, which rewards us for drawing cards while punishing the opponent for doing the same. Got a bit of additional removal with 3 copies of Infernal Grasp and 4 copies of Voltage Surge, which can also easily sacrifice one of our artifacts to deal 4 damage as opposed to 2 at instant speed. And then Synthesizer, another staple in these sacrifice decks, as it can provide a bit of card advantage when it enters a battlefield by exiling the top card that we get to play for the turn, as it can also play lands. You typically won't see players play Synthesizer on turn 1, since you want to try and get as much value out of it as possible, and it will also trigger once again once it's sacrificed, sacrificed. You can also sacrifice it yourself to make a 2/2 Samurai token. And then we also have 4 copies of Deadly Dispute, which rotated out of Standard, but is still legal in Alchemy thanks to the Baldur's Gate printing, and of course a great card draw effect that will leave behind a treasure token, which is another artifact we can maybe sacrifice to the Anvil. And then the mana base also includes 4 copies of Forsaken Crossroads, which is a pretty unique Alchemy card that rewards you for being on the draw, as it can potentially come into play untapped, make your choice of red or black in this deck, and then can also come into play tapped and scry 1 instead. And potential sideboard cards, in addition to Mind Spike and Ray of Enfeeblement that we mentioned earlier, we could also see Curse of Shaken Faith as a pretty unique solution to the Cabaretti Revels combo decks in the format. Despite Graining Ignis being banned, players have still tried to perfect this new take on the Cabaretti Revels combo, which is a deck that often casts a whole bunch of spells in the same turn, and a Curse of Shaken Faith is a great way to punish the opponent for doing that. And then a Xander's Wake, another unique 2-mana enchantment that could synergize quite nicely in a sacrifice deck, letting you conjure various cards in the process. Next up, we're taking a look at Blue-Red Spells, which is a draw-go style of control deck that typically wants to pass the turn with all its mana available, so it can use its counter spells and other instant speed plays accordingly. There's Essence Scatter to counter creature spells at 2 mana, Negate handles non-creature spells, and at 3 mana there's an all-purpose counterspell with Ertai's Scorn, can also potentially get a 1 mana discount, and at 4 mana Kindred Denial also lets us seek a card with the same mana value as the countered spell, so it can be a very nice 2-for-1. Then we've got some instant speed removal with Flame Blessed Bolt at 1 mana, dealing 2 damage, potentially exiling a creature or planeswalker in the process. Can be a nice answer to recursive creatures like Tenacious Underdog. And then we've got Fires of Victory, which is a new spell from Dominaria that can also be kicked for 2 and a blue, in which case we get to draw a card, then dealing damage equal to the number of cards in hand to a creature or planeswalker, so also rewards us for keeping a pretty full grip. Consider is a cheap cantrip that can put an additional card into our graveyard, and Thirst for Discovery will let us draw 3 and then discard 2 unless we discard a basic land card. So all these instants will end up in our graveyard, where they're gonna fuel our Tolarian Terror, a 7 mana 5/5 with Ward 2, but it gets a 1 mana discount for each instant and sorcery card in our graveyard, so we can often cast the Tolarian for pretty cheap and still keep up our counter spells. And then our author win condition is Kalim Djinn Emperor, a 6 mana 5/6 legendary Djinn Noble with Flying and Ward 2, and we can also discard Kalim for 1 and a blue, in which case we can tap up to 1 target non-land permanent, and we get to draw a card, and then we also conjure a card named Kalim Djinn Emperor into our library 7th from the top. Then if there are enough copies of Kalim into our graveyard, we can even put one in play from our graveyard essentially for free, although it does enter tapped. So Kalim is pretty good in a deck that can see a lot of cards with Consider and Thirst for Discovery, so we can quickly find more copies, so we can potentially get it in play without needing to cast it for 6 mana. And then potential sideboard cards could include Burn Down the House as a way to catch back up against aggressive decks in case our counter spells failed to protect us, and then it's also potentially a 5 mana card we can find with Kindred Denial, which otherwise cannot seek any other 5 mana card in our deck. Then we could also see a Braid as a cheap removal spell that can also hit artifacts, maybe even a Timely Interference as a cheap cantrip that can also save a bit of life against creature decks, and could even see a transformational sideboard plan with Haughty Djinn in case the opponent takes out their removal spells like Molten Impact, which deals 4 damage. Since it doesn't line up well against our main deck creatures with 5 or 6 toughness, then we can bring in Haughty Djinn, which can now wreak havoc on the opponent while giving our spells a 1 mana discount. Next we have Michael's 4-color Domain deck, which features cards like Leyline Binding, an enchantment with Flash that when it enters battlefield exiles target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield, and this gets a 1 mana discount for each basic land type among the lands we control. And our mana base includes a ton of these tri-lands from Streets of New Capenna, which have 3 different basic land types, so we can pretty quickly get to all 5 types for Domain, even as early as turn 2, which makes a Leyline Binding a very efficient removal spell. And despite not having any green spells in the main deck, we're still playing some of these green tri-lands just to enable a Domain. Another Domain card is Drag to the Bottom, which is going to be a powerful sweeper, giving each creature -X/-X until end of turn, where X is a 1 plus the number of basic land types among lands we control, so it can be up to -6/-6. We also have Shadow Prophecy as a 3-mana instant speed card draw effect, letting us look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the number of basic line types, and then we can put up to 2 of them into our hand and the rest into our graveyard, and we also lose 2 life. And then we've got more instant speed card draw with Painful Bonde at 2 mana, which lets us draw 2. And then more spot removal, including Fires of Victory, which can also be kicked to draw card, Molten Impact dealing 4 damage for 2 mana at sorcery speed, and can potentially save the excess damage to deal it next time we cast an instant or sorcery spell, and then Fragment Reality at 1 mana, exiling target non-token artifact, creature, or enchantment, and then its controller puts a random creature card with a lesser mana value from their library onto the battlefield tapped. So if it targets a 1 mana creature, it likely doesn't give the opponent anything in return, but can also be a nice answer to enchantments like the Cabareti Revels, which can otherwise be a problem once it starts generating too much card advantage, so just a nice versatile 1 mana answer. And then there's 2 counterspells with Bind to Secrecy, which is a better negate that can also conjure a duplicate of a target creature card in an opponent's graveyard into our hand. And then if there are 5 or more mana values among cards in our graveyard, we can also draft a card from its spellbook, which we can see here. And even if we don't like the card we drafted with Bind to Secrecy, we can always discard it to the second chapter of Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, another staple in Standard, making its way into Alchemy. And then our other win conditions include Sphinx of Clear Skies at 5 mana, a 5/5 with Flying and Ward 2 that can provide a ton of card advantage if it manages to hit the opponent, especially if we have the full domain enabled, and then 1 copy of the Jin Emperor as well. And then of course our mana base has all these trial lands, which can also be cycled late game if we're flooding out a bit. And then having all these colors in our mana base means we can play pretty much any sideboard cards we want. A card like Sunset Revelry could come in handy to gain a bit of life to offset the life loss of Shadow Prophecy, so we can also maybe make some tokens to buy time against creature decks until we can wipe the board. And then last but certainly not least, we're taking a look at Hall of Famer Shota Yasooka's Esper deck, featuring 4 copies of a Diviner of Fates, a 3-mana 2/3, that when it enters the battlefield lets us connive, so we can draw and then discard, and whenever we discard 1 or more cards, we seek a card that shares a card type with one of the discarded cards, only triggers once each turn. So the Diviner can enable itself, but also works very nicely with other discard effects, like our various specialized creatures, for instance. The Nightsinger's Disciple requires us to discard a card as an additional cost to specialize, can turn into Disciple of Blood, Disciple of Rebirth, or Disciple of Arcana, which can get back an instant or sorcery from our graveyard. And then at 4 mana there's Lazel, which is very difficult for the opponent to get rid of with spot removal thanks to its ability, and can hit incredibly hard, especially once we specialize it. And then we also have 4 copies of Kalim, which also has great synergy with the Diviner of Fates, as we can discard it to enable its ability. And then we also have 1 copy of Shieldred, and 3 copies of Tasha, which is a powerful planeswalker that can shrink opposing creatures down with -1/-1 counters if they're trying to attack us, and then can also potentially ultimate to mill the opponent for a bunch and get their creatures on our side of the battlefield. And then the rest of the deck includes lots of cheap interaction with Cutdown as removal, Break Expectation as a discard effect, then a Bind to Secrecy for non-creatures, Infernal Grasp as more spot removal, Undersimplify as another counterspell, Seek New Knowledge, a cheap cantrip effect letting us seek 2 non-land cards, putting a card from our hand on the bottom of our library. Then we've got Essence Scatter for creatures, and a Disdainful Stroke for more expensive cards, and at 3 mana Void Rend as an uncounterable removal spell. And then a mana base has a ton of goodies, including the Crossroads, Rafine's Tower, the new Pain lands from Dominaria, as well as the various channel lands that can also get a discount if we control a legendary creature. And then potential sideboard cards could include some sweepers like Meathook Massacre or Farewell, since there's no sweepers in the main deck. Could see the typical 1-mana interaction like Mind Spike and Rave Enfeeblement, but even a more conditional card like Knockout Blow could be quite effective against Mono-Red, as it can also gain a bit of extra life back. So this was a quick glimpse into the decks you might expect to see this weekend during the Arena Championship 1 coverage, so make sure to check it out. But for now, I want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.